Hello, and welcome to the Dementia Capable webinar series provided by the Rosalind Carter Institute for Caregiving in partnership with the Georgia Division on Aging Services. Before getting started, we advise having a pen and paper ready to write down any information and links to the resources as they are provided. Otherwise, you will have to view the webinar again to retrieve it later. You may pause the webinar now if needed. Remember that the link to the SurveyMonkey post-test will be pasted onto the last slide. The post-test will remain open for an indefinite amount of time. Please take it at your earliest convenience, though we encourage immediately following the webinar. A certificate can be provided when entering your email address at the end of the post-test. Today's webinar will be Life After Diagnosis, Finding the Silver Lining, presented by Gail Alston. Gail Alston began her work at the Rosalind Carter Institute for Caregiving in 2007 as the director of the Caregiver Support Program serving the local community. In 2008, she stepped into the position of Director of Community Initiatives, where she provided leadership and technical assistance for implementing evidence-based caregiver programs around the state of Georgia. In 2013, Gail became the first director of the RCI Training Center for Excellence, providing training, certification, and technical assistance for a menu of evidence-based caregiver support programs around the nation. Currently, Gail is also leading the Dealing with Dementia project, providing training for RCI's newly created comprehensive reference guide to dementia family and professional caregivers around the state of Georgia. Gail earned her bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in business management from Georgia Southwestern State University and her master's degree in community counseling from Columbus State University. Welcome, Gail.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I am so glad to be here today sharing with you what I'm learning about dementia. Now, I imagine anybody who saw this title who is caring for someone with dementia thinks I probably don't know anything about it, because if I did, I certainly wouldn't be talking about a silver lining after diagnosis. However, I was my mother's caregiver. My mother had vascular dementia, so I know exactly how heartbreaking it is. I know what a cruel disease it is. But you know, in the 4 years since my mother passed away, I've learned so much about the capabilities of people with dementia and also about different caregiving techniques that I only wish I had known while I was still caregiving. And that's why it's so important to me to share with people the things I'm learning through these webinars. And I hope that by the end of the webinar, you'll feel better equipped and somewhat more optimistic about your caregiving journey with your loved ones. Now, there's no denying that a dementia diagnosis is a harsh diagnosis to hear. There was a study carried out by the Alzheimer's Society in Great Britain, and I'm going to share with you some of the statistics. I think you'll find them a little surprising. Dementia is the most feared health condition. Almost 2/3 of people surveyed felt that a diagnosis would mean their life was over. Research also shows that there's still a lot of myths out there about dementia, and that's what's really impacting people's willingness to seek a diagnosis. Almost 1 in 4 people thought that people who receive a dementia diagnosis would instantly have to stop going out for a walk on their own. Almost half thought that they would have to immediately stop driving a car. 58% thought that they would personally struggle with joining conversations just post-diagnosis. 49% worried that people would think that they were mad or insane. Over half of people think a dementia diagnosis means no longer enjoying the things that they used to. And 68% think that they would no longer be the same person if they were to be diagnosed with dementia. You know, some of these beliefs are the cause of stigma, and some of these beliefs are because of stigma. But one thing is for sure, stigma is playing a role in how people living with dementia are treated by their doctors, by their bosses, by their friends and family, by their caregivers. It's even impacting how they think of themselves, as demonstrated by the statistics I just shared with you. So what is stigma? Well, sociologist Irving Goffman defines stigma as an attribute that is deeply discrediting and that reduces the bearer from a whole and usual person to a tainted, discounted one. Now, we do know that dementia impacts how a person communicates, interacts, how they move through their lives. However, the stigma here is applied to people immediately upon diagnosis, and that is what we have to fight against, and that is what we have to be aware of so we do not fall prey to those same misbeliefs. Now, why do you suppose that society stigmatizes medical conditions? Well, there are basically these three reasons. First of all, there's a lot of fear around certain medical conditions, and that kind of makes sense when a medical condition is contagious, right? Nobody wants to be around. Like if you know your friend has flu, you're not going to go sit around them and share a Coke with them. However, if the condition is in no way passed through contagions, then why would we still be afraid? Well, some people have a fear that if they're around someone who's been diagnosed with dementia, then they might say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing or not know how to respond to that person. There's also the fear that's generated by the knowledge that, that could be me. It's especially true in a situation where the condition such as dementia, the doctors really don't have any way to protect us. They're still trying to figure out what's going on, causing these different kinds of dementia. So there's a fear that knowledge that, there but for the grace of God go I. I could also be diagnosed with this condition at some point. And then there's the fact that people just don't really understand dementia. It's so misunderstood. It's really surprising how little people know about dementia unless they've been personally impacted by it. And what's even more surprising is many people who are caring for others with dementia or who have family members with dementia still are woefully underinformed about the truth of what their loved one is capable of and what they're dealing with. Then there's good old-fashioned social prejudice. Now, we all know about social prejudices. They come in all sorts of forms. When you think about it, there are racial prejudices, there are geographic prejudices, there are education prejudice, income level. There's a lot of different reasons why people can label each other so that they can generate this us versus them mentality. And people do that for a number of reasons. I think that they do that. They like to label people with dementia as being less than because that's another way of making them feel safe. If we can say those people over there, they're the ones that have this problem, then I'm safe because I'm standing over here. Unfortunately, people can be cruel, but cruelty generally sprouts from ignorance and fear. And we can do something about that. Examples of stigma that we've seen before in our lifetime was cancer. There was a time when people didn't even say the word cancer out loud. Then they went to calling it the big C. We all, probably everybody remembers a time when people who had mental illnesses they could have been kept locked away in attics, for goodness sakes, way back in the early 1900s. You may remember people with developmental disabilities. When I was growing up, if parents were told that if they had a child with a developmental disability, just put them over there in that group home and walk away and just forget that you had that child. It's hard to imagine now. Think of all the joy that children with developmental disabilities bring to their parents because they've been mainstreamed into society and are given the opportunity to live to their best possible abilities. Even more recent is HIV/AIDS. There was a time when there was a panic about HIV/AIDS, and people thought that even through casual contact that they would be able to catch AIDS from people. Of course, that's all been disproved now. Well, these days we have the stigma of dementia, and we must all engage in working to reduce and hopefully stop the stigma experienced by people diagnosed with dementia and their caregivers. And I hope that during our talk today, you'll understand ways in which you can be working to fight dementia. Now, what are the results that happen? They're pretty severe and they're dangerous. because there is a cost to the stigma. Families living with dementia truly cannot afford and should not have to bear this huge cost. You know, stigma is the reason a large percentage of people put off seeing their doctor and receiving treatment early in the disease process. And what we're learning more and more every single day is that early treatment, early response can really prolong the healthy years that a person who's been diagnosed with dementia has. Stigma is the reason behind the shame a person who's being diagnosed feels. They feel as if they've done something wrong, and somehow the disease is their fault, and that's just not true. Stigma is the reason behind the isolation the person living with dementia and their caregivers often experience. People tend to back away, and they stay away, and that's just heartbreaking and cruel. Stigma is the reason behind the reluctance some caregivers feel about seeking services and support from friends and other families. So many times I've seen a wife or husband caregiver who are denying their children the opportunity to help them and support them because they're too ashamed to let their children know what's really going on. That costs their children. So many times their children would just be there for them if only they had been allowed to know what their parents were struggling with. Stigma is the reason caregivers sometimes overprotect or discount their loved ones. I've been there. I know how easy it is to dismiss a complaint or request as a dementia talking, only to find out later that Mama was speaking the truth. And I just chalked it up to dementia because I did not understand how capable she still was. Stigma plays a huge role in the experience of both the person diagnosed and their families and caregivers, and not in a good way. It often makes a difficult situation much, much worse. Now, I want you to write this name down, Teepa Snow. If you're not already familiar with Teepa Snow, you need to be. She has a lot of videos on her website that give great tips on dementia care. She's very upbeat, and she also is a wonderful advocate for people living with dementia. And she fights for them to maintain their dignity and their respect. Because, as she says, dementia does not rob someone of their dignity. It's our reaction to them that does. So today, during our webinar, these are my objectives. I want you to be able to recognize the impact of stigma on your loved one and yourself as a caregiver. I'm going to introduce you to some people who were diagnosed with dementia but refused to give in to the stigma. They defied the stigma, and they've done remarkable things for years after diagnosis. And then we're going to talk about some stigma-defying strategies that will help you put life back into the living for both you and your loved one. You know, as I said earlier, a lot of stigma comes from these myths and these misconceptions, I'll get it out, about dementia. And here is one that when you first look at it, you go, well, what's so harmful about that? Well, the problem is if people believe that the problems they're experiencing with memory, and especially if it's beginning to impact the way they function and their daily lives, if they just write that off as normal aging, then they don't seek treatment. They don't seek the help of their doctor because they're just saying, I'm just getting older. So they do nothing. And even though there's no cure or prevention for dementia, these various types of dementia, that doesn't mean that there aren't things that can be done and lifestyle changes that can be brought about that can really impact the quality of life for both the person with dementia and their caregiver for an extended period of time. However, if people avoid diagnosis, avoid seeing their doctor, they won't access those changes and those treatments that can make a huge difference in the life of the entire family. But you have to have a diagnosis and a treatment plan to realize those benefits. Another misconception is that people with Alzheimer's become agitated, violent, and aggressive. Now, depending on what stage the person living with dementia in your life is in, you may or may not have already experienced the agitation that often comes with dementia. We're going to talk a little bit later about what might bring that on. But what people don't understand, because they see on TV or they see in movies, or they may have been around a loved one who became agitated and even aggressive, what they don't understand that that's not going on all the time. Sure, people with dementia at some point in the progression of the disease may show signs of agitation and aggression. However, what we're learning is that there are ways to circumvent that when caregivers have better ideas about how to kind of head it off at the pass, and when people in society, the people around them, have a better understanding of how to communicate and how to be around people with dementia so that they don't trigger some of those feelings that will generate the agitation. Avoiding people with dementia for fear of an angry outburst is like avoiding people with red hair because you saw a redhead person committing a violent crime on the news last night. Dementia affects people differently and at different stages, and their experience of their daily lives remain just as individualized as they did before the diagnosis. Another misconception is people with Alzheimer's can't function, can't have a quality of life, and can't enjoy activities. That is just not true. Think about it. Yesterday, the person living with dementia was functioning fairly well, might have been having some memory problems, might have had some weird things going on that they didn't understand, and that's why they went to the doctor for the diagnosis, but they were still functioning fairly normally. They just wanted to say, what's going on here? I need some answers. And then all of a sudden, they get a diagnosis, and you would think that they completely changed overnight. And that's the way we tend to treat them. That's the way society tends to treat them. But it's jumping to judgment way too soon. A dementia diagnosis shouldn't mean give up. It should mean rev up. You may have noticed that I often refer to dementia patients as people living with dementia. And I encourage you to refer to your loved one as living with dementia as well. Otherwise, the general consensus is that they're dying with dementia. Well, truth be told, none of us are guaranteed even the next 30 minutes. We could all truthfully say we're all dying from life itself. You know, it's not unusual for people live 20 years after diagnosis. And you know what? With new medications and treatments and new ways of managing the disease, new lifestyle changes that can impact the progression of disease, many of those 20 years can be good years, engaged in meaningful life experiences. This is the light at the end of the tunnel, the silver lining that I'm referring to. We no longer have to just throw up our hands and wait for the end and suffer through this dementia diagnosis, because we're learning that through a good treatment plan and lifestyle changes, people living with dementia can have many years of good, productive life. And guess what? Their caregivers can enjoy that time with them as well. Now, doesn't this just break your heart? Because of stigma, friends feel it's just best to stay away. And as you probably know, isolation is one of the hardest parts of dementia. Stigma must be overcome. So medical professionals, friends, and even family caregivers seem to immediately label the person with dementia diagnosis as the walking dead. We're not going to stand for that anymore because it's just not true. Now, you may be saying, you may be caring for a person living with dementia that's in the later stages, but you know what? Even in the end stages of the illness, there can be very positive experiences for both the person living with dementia and their caregivers. They can still feel your love, they can feel your presence, and you can find ways to interact with them that's going to be meaningful for both of you. So we're not going to accept this walking dead business. We're going to be sure that we have lives full of joy and laughter as long as possible. Now, I want you to take a moment to jot down this title and author. I'm going to read you an excerpt from it. I think it really demonstrates how we need to shift the way we think about people diagnosed with dementia. This is about Graham. A short time ago, I met a gentleman with dementia called Graham. We soon found that we had a common love for football, and by chance his team had recently beaten my team. I thought to myself he wouldn't be able to remember the game. However, Graham soon started to take me through a detailed discussion of his game and others. This incident made me realize how often I still focus on the dementia first before seeing the person. In other words, I knew Graham had dementia. I presumed he wouldn't remember. It also made me consider how often we focus on the dementia. But you might ask, what does this matter? I believe that if we only concentrate on a person's losses, this will ultimately have a detrimental effect on the self-esteem of the person with dementia and also our own belief of what a person can do. If we take over from people and do tasks that people can still do independently or with some encouragement, then not only will we cause the person frustration and embarrassment, we'll also increase the chance of the person becoming more dependent on us. Finally, by focusing on skills rather than just losses, this is a way of helping people living with dementia to remain positive. Now, I have to plead guilty here. When my mother was diagnosed with dementia, when she started having her health issues, I would have wrapped her in a bubble if I could have. I was all about protecting her. I wanted to wait on her hand and foot. I wanted to make her life as easy as possible. I was wrong. And if I could redo it, I would do it very differently. Even though it might have taken her longer to do some of the things I did for her, I would have much rather put that time into letting her be as independent as possible, as long as it's safe. Now, as a caregiver, I've just admitted I've made some assumptions about my mama's ability that were wrong and unfair. You don't want to make the same mistakes I make. So always see the person, not the dementia. Now here I'm going to introduce you to Kate Swaffer. She's an example of how refusing to fall prey to stigma and staying engaged with her pre-diagnosis life can make an astounding difference in how the disease progresses. She was just 49 years old when doctors said that her inability to remember some words and her mix-up of colors and numbers was actually dementia. She's now 58 and an advocate for people with dementia. She's outlived the prognosis that said she would die in 6 to 10 years. And also, not only she outlived that prognosis, she's been living a full, active life and achieving far more than many people who don't have dementia. Currently studying for a PhD, it's hard to believe that the eloquent speaker and activist was told by her doctors almost a decade ago to quit her sales job, pull out of university, and get her end of life in order. Doctors told her to consider a day in an aged care home 1 day a month so she could get used to the place she might eventually call home. In Kate's words, following a diagnosis of dementia, I was told to give up work, give up study, and to go home and live for the time I had left. Kate calls this prescribed disengagement. As she put it, why is it that one day I was studying for a degree, working full-time, volunteering, raising a family, running a household with my husband, and the next day I was told to give it all up, give up life as I knew it, and start living for the time I had left. So, yes, she recognized that society hadn't intentionally set out to devalue her, but the consequences of stigma is still the same. There are so many examples of doctors telling their patients to go home and prepare to die. There are also many examples of people losing their jobs after a diagnosis. Putting people out to pasture like used-up racehorses because they have a brain disease is unacceptable. Not to mention a sad loss of the talent and skills they can continue to provide if given the chance. In fact, it would be better for everyone, and I do mean everyone, if doctors wrote a prescription to be as engaged as possible in activities that stimulate and provide joy to the person living with dementia. As I said, they should not give up, they should rev up. And that's the way to have much more quality of life for much longer. In my opinion, prescribed disengagement is a form of malpractice, and if your doctor has this mindset, find another doctor. Because as you can see, it emphasizes the fear, the hopelessness. When people are told just to give up, guess what? They do. When people are constantly telling you can't do something or stepping in and doing things for you because they don't believe you can do things, that leads to helplessness. And it makes defeat as the starting point for people with a diagnosis. Again, unacceptable. Now, in the words of Kate Swaffer, she says, I pursued and still carry out to this day non-pharmacological and positive psychosocial interventions daily, some more than once a day, as if it was the Olympics training of my life. And I really like that. When she's talking about non-pharmacological and positive psychological interventions, she's just talking about different activities and choices that have nothing to do with medicines or prescriptions, that they're all about creating the best quality of life possible for the person living with dementia and their families. I really like that, like training for Olympics, and I think that's what people living with dementia need to think of in their daily lives, because they're probably going to have to make some lifestyle changes, and that's just as important as an Olympic trainer. Again, in the words of Kate, I believe that people with dementia must stay engaged in their pre-diagnosis lives for as long as possible, and for younger people to remain employed whilst they want to, requesting assistance and support for their disabilities as a person who's been disabled by other illness or an accident. This will help to remove the myths about dementia and the discrimination, stigma, and isolation. It will help others see that people with dementia are still very capable of contributing positively to society and living well. You and your loved one can make a difference in how those around you understand dementia. You and your loved one can be part of the fight against stigma just by staying active and being out and about, refusing to be shunned away. All right, now I want to introduce you to Richard Taylor. For more than 40 years, he was a Houston clinical psychologist. He treated others with mental health issues. In 2002, he was diagnosed with dementia, probably of the Alzheimer's type. He was 58 at the time. Richard tells us that for about 3 weeks he cried every day. You know, even though I'm trying to sell the silver lining, I know that grief is going to be part of your life when you or a loved one are diagnosed. That's just normal. It would be harmful to try to just ignore or hide from the very reaction of grief, the very human reaction of grief. So express your grief and anger, do it in a healthy way, but don't get stuck there. Move on to the next step. And the next step is learning to live with dementia. That's what Richard Taylor did. He was determined not to join the nearly 40% of people with Alzheimer's disease who became clinically depressed. He found purpose in writing about his fears and his triumphs. He called it as a way to gain control over what was happening between his ears. He writes, writing became my therapy without a copay. He wrote a book, Alzheimer's from the Inside Out. He said, I wrote to reassure myself that some of the old me was still there because I was in transition in ways no one seemed to understand. Alzheimer's from the Inside Out is a good book for people to read to gain understanding of what that experience is like. Sadly, Richard Taylor passed away in 2015, 13 years after his diagnosis, but not from complications due to his dementia, but he passed away from complications from cancer. And during those 13 years after diagnosis, he wrote this book, wrote other books. He was a very active advocate, and he was also one of the founders of the Dementia Alliance International. That's another, Dementia Beyond Disease. Both of these books would be excellent reads. Let me introduce you to Christine Bryden. Christine was a biochemist She was just 46 when she was diagnosed with dementia. She'd just been divorced. The last thing she expected was a diagnosis of dementia. And you know what? Just like Kate, the doctor's prognosis was grim. He said, in about 5 years you'll be demented, in 3 years in a nursing home, and then you'll die. That was 20 years ago. She's still going strong. She says her current neurologist calls her remarkable because he hasn't seen anybody last 20 years and still be talking. To me, she says, to me it's tragic that our imagery of dementia is of the elderly so that people who are younger don't get the sorts of support that they need. But I would also add that our expectations of people who are elderly who develop dementia is also distorted. These are the books that Christine has written since her diagnosis. She keeps physically active, socially engaged. She challenges herself to learn new things. Yes, people with dementia can learn new things. Might take them longer. They might need to spend more energy in the learning process, but they can still learn new things. Christine is a great example of how choosing to battle the stigma and refuse to give in to the disease takes courage, determination, and a great deal of energy. And she also suggests that you have to surround yourself with positive energy and positive people. Christine has upended stereotypes about living with dementia, and her can-do spirit led her to complete a postgraduate degree. She remarried, and she speaks and advocates for people living with dementia around the world. Now, this sweet-looking lady is Jennifer Butte. She was a general practitioner. She was an MD for 25 years. She resigned from her practice because she knew something was wrong with her brain. She was having experiences she knew wasn't right, and she started going to doctors, but it still took her 5 years to get a diagnosis. Some of you may understand how difficult getting that diagnosis is at times. But in spite of her inability to recognize people she'd known for years and her ongoing hallucinations, she continues to lecture on her experiences living with dementia, and she serves as an inspiration. She's just delightful. As she puts it, it is 6 years since my diagnosis, and I'm convinced cognitive stimulation in a social context with laughter, exercise, good diet, appropriate medication, etc., can make a tremendous difference. And I've been so encouraged to see increasing evidence to support this. Now, you may be saying, well, that's fine and well, but our friends have all disappeared. And I know that happens a lot for the reasons we've already talked about. It's easy to become resentful and angry at the people who thought you thought you could count on. There may be even family members who kind of disappeared. But you know what? A better response is to simply make new friends. You can find a support group. Your first stop should be your Alzheimer's Association. Your second stop should be an internet and Google for Alzheimer's or dementia support groups in your area. Now, some people are reluctant to go into support groups because they think it's just people sitting around moaning and groaning and feeling sorry for themselves. Nothing could be further from the truth. Support groups are full of people just like you. They come together, they share information, they share solutions. You know that problem you're dealing with this week? Somebody else just found out what to do about that last week, and they'll be at the support group to help you figure it out too. I bet you've come up with some pretty creative solutions as well, and that would be your opportunity to share what you've learned and the problems that you've been able to solve. Go to a support group. Help others and let them help you. These people are your tribe. They understand. They will lift you up. They won't judge or pull back because they are walking in your shoes. Now, in order to keep the person living with dementia, your loved one, engaged in social activities, if their friends have disappeared on them, then, again, time to make new friends. Have you ever heard of a memory cafe? This is an example of a toolkit, and I'd encourage you to Google this and go to this website. But the Neighborhood Memory Cafe is a place where individuals with memory loss and their caregivers can get together. It's in a safe, supportive, and engaging environment. It's a time and place where people can interact, laugh, even cry together if they need to. You find support, you share concerns, you celebrate triumphs. There's no reason to feel embarrassed or misunderstood. Again, this is your tribe. If there's not a memory cafe in your area, you might want to talk to your church members, or you might want to call your Alzheimer's Association, see how you can help them get one started. This toolkit is online. They'll give you a lot of tips about it. People living with dementia will feel more ready to engage with others who understand what their struggles might be and who don't cause them to be embarrassed or feel ashamed of it. I think memory cafes are a wonderful invention, and I hope you can find one near you. There's also a lot of churches are beginning to start what we're calling respite ministry. Google it, see if it's out there. These ministries are specifically for people living with dementia and their caregivers. They have activities, they have exercises, and it's kind of like the cafe, but it's a little more structured, and they'll have a number of volunteers or staff people that are kind of intermingled among the participants. It's a lot of fun. I saw one over in Montgomery, Alabama, and again, if there's not one in your area and you're active in a church, then go to your minister and see if they might be interested in starting respite ministry. And if so, contact me. I can put you in touch with some people who know how to get it done. It's a wonderful thing to bring to the community. All right, back to that sweet Jennifer Butte. Oh, I just love this woman. When you go to her website, look there. You see what she calls glorious opportunity. She considers her dementia diagnosis a glorious opportunity. And when you navigate through her website, there's some wonderful videos and suggestions, and it'll be such a lift for you to visit with her there. And she's a great inspiration. And even though it's hard to imagine someone calling a diagnosis of dementia as a glorious opportunity, I must tell you that as I've read so many stories of people living with dementia, I've heard that more than once, that people say that living with dementia has given their life more meaning because it's giving them a purpose that they can demonstrate and inspire others not to just fold up and go home and live in darkness, but to defy the stigma and to live your life with meaning and purpose. That website, write it down. That's how you get, but you can always just Google glorious opportunity. Charles Snyder wrote this book, Don't Bury Me, It Ain't Over Yet, which is a pretty humorous title. He was a policeman and a fireman, and at the age of 52, he learned that he had early onset Alzheimer's disease. I want to share with you the introduction to this book. In this book, you will read of good times and heartbreaking times. I've endeavored to reduce the gloominess that I've found in much other literature about Alzheimer's disease without trivializing the event it mercilessly plagues its victims, the extent it mercilessly plagues its victims. Nobody's saying that Alzheimer's isn't hard, but we don't have to live in the gloom. Personally, at this point in my life, I have not yet suffered the depression that so often accompanies early onset Alzheimer's disease. I admit it provides many daily challenges, but then so does life in general. Being diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease is not cause to immediately start digging your grave. I intend on contributing more to this old world as long as possible, so please don't bury me. It ain't over yet. Here, Mr. Snyder brings up the importance of adaptation, and we're going to discuss that a little bit more fully later. But, you know, he makes the point. If you lose a leg, you eventually accept it and get used to doing things without it. Those with Alzheimer's must empower themselves by writing notes, or he says we keep Post-it in business. You need adaptation to stay as engaged as possible for as long as possible. And I'm not sure, I don't know, maybe y'all have already thought of this, but I'm not sure that I did enough adaptation when I was caring for my mother. Wish I had. Now this is, Schneider described the Alzheimer's Association of St. Louis as one of the biggest and best-run organizations in the country. But I got to tell you, Alzheimer's Association is pretty phenomenal everywhere. We have seen, I've worked with many of the offices, and I'm always so impressed by the support and the different classes they offer. If you have not availed yourself of the Alzheimer's Association, please do so at your earliest convenience. And if you have a Lewy bodies diagnosis or other type of dementia diagnosis, call them anyway, because they will do their best to help you. Charles is motivated to speak out because he said that for every person who sought help from the Alzheimer's Association, there were hundreds who suffered alone. And this is true because people either don't know about it or they're letting the stigma keep them from reaching out for help. He says, some in our group were diagnosed 8 years ago. Because of new medicines, they work the internet, give speeches, and live fairly normal lives. This is not the picture that society is painting for us, and this is the picture we want to get out. And I hope this is a picture that you'll be able to live with your loved one. And just in case you missed it, here is the website for Alzheimer's Association, just alz.org, really easy to find, and you can navigate to your local chapter through there. Also, let me tell you something. This 800 number is open 24/7. It's not voicemail. There is a human being there. If something wakes you up in the middle of the night at 2 o'clock in the morning and you need somebody to talk to, here's your number. Call them up. Give them a chance to help you out. You might just need someone to listen to you, or you might have specific questions. Please write this number down and reach out to the Alzheimer's Association. Now, you may be thinking this is fine for people in the early to mid stages, but my loved one is more advanced than that. And the message for you is that you can continue to connect. I think I mentioned this earlier, but it bears repeating. You can continue to connect with your loved one to give them what they need. This booklet, this later stage Alzheimer's disease, I pulled this up. You know, you can Google caregiving and late stage dementia, and there's all sorts of resources. I looked through this one. I was really impressed by all the information they had. So I do recommend that, and there's a website you can go. But please don't stop there. Google can be your best friend and your worst enemy because it can be overwhelming. But if you start with the Alzheimer's Association and some tried and true resources such as this, that they won't steer you wrong. Stay away from the websites that are telling you they have found a cure, and if you just do this, that, and the other and send me $50, I can help cure. Stay away from those sites. So this is what I'm thinking. It's time for a paradigm shift, a time for a new way of thinking, a new way of looking at things, a new way of living with dementia, and a new way of caring for someone living with dementia. We want this medical model out, and we want the social model in. Now, what do I mean by that? I don't mean throw out the medical community. It's still important to see your doctor. It's important to see the right doctor. It's important to find a doctor who is proactive and who does not just write off people who are elderly and have dementia. Find the doctor who's going to work with you to keep your loved one as vital and engaged as possible for as long as possible. But the medical model is, that's what I have a problem with. And let me tell you why. Because it focuses on deficits and loss. It sees dementia as a clinical syndrome characterized by global cognitive impairment which represents a decline from previous level of functioning and is associated with impairment in functional ability. This may be a true statement, but that's not all there is, because where people are beginning to have these problems of functioning, or maybe they're farther down the road and they might have a significant level of change in their functioning and their cognitive abilities, but there's still a lot of good things going on, and with the right treatment and lifestyle changes, we can focus on that instead of the loss. This is how we need to shift the way we're looking at caregivers, and we need to demand that our medical professionals shift the way they look at it too. Now, the social model focuses on the individual experience. There's a lot of different variables that's going to impact a person living with dementia and how they're going to progress in that disease. We need to be individualizing that experience, and we also, even more importantly, we need to keep our focus on the remaining strengths and abilities. Instead of, oh, woe is me, they can't do it. Well, look at what they can do. How can I focus on that? How am I going to make their daily lives more engaged and more fun and bright by using the things that they can still do? Remember Kate Swaffer, good old Kate? Well, Kate is a big proponent. She's really supports this whole idea about the disability model, and it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. I'm going to read what she says here. She says, the disability model of care is positive and supports continued engagement with our pre-diagnosis lives. At the University of South Australia, I was referred by my lecturers to the disability advisor and set up with the disability access plan, active for the continuation and completion of my studies. This access plan evolved as the symptoms demanded, changing the same way it would if I'd had acquired a brain injury. Now think about that. Or a disease like multiple sclerosis where symptoms are regularly changing. I was treated as a whole person with support for the disabilities rather than being advised to disengage and give up. If I had been referred to a brain injury unit, I would have been proactively treated to live with the very, very best life possible with the injury or disease I have. I get so excited about this because this is a revolutionary way of looking at people living with dementia. Instead of saying, okay, yesterday you were okay, today I give you a diagnosis, and now you can't function anymore in any real and important way. But if you look at the dementia as a disability, you would look at them and say, okay, you have this disability. What are the changes we're going to make to your environment, your lifestyle? How are we going to adjust those things to support you to be as independent as possible for as long as possible? So the significant and positive impact on being meaningfully and positively engaged is paramount to a person's well-being. Their motivation to fight against the symptoms of dementia, the overcoming the emotional toll of a diagnosis. So I hear this in my research. I hear this over and over again. Meaningful and positively engaged. That's what. So instead of following that doctor's diagnosis, they go home, get your things in order, and wait to die. No, don't give up. Rev up. Dementia is about adaptation. You know, those living with cognitive impairments and their caregivers are constantly adapting to the changes wrought by the disease. Sometimes those adaptations are subtly applied and integrated into the daily routine. Other times, a drastic adjustment is required for both parties. Nevertheless, adaptation is a regular, recurring part of the life with Alzheimer's. We should look at those adaptations. Sometimes I know we think about, oh, now we got to do, but instead of that, look at it as, okay, we get to do this so that we can enable our loved one to continue to enjoy that. That's the way we need to be looking at it. And, you know, a lot of people, remember when I was giving you those statistics back in the very beginning and how some people thought, well, once I'm diagnosed, I'm not the same person. Once I'm diagnosed, I won't enjoy the same things. That's hogwash. I have dementia, but I'm still me. People living with dementia should be encouraged to continue with the activities they've enjoyed. Whatever adaptations need to be done, do them. But, perhaps you need to be in the room to supervise some of the things. Sometimes we might have to sit beside them and kind of be doing alongside so that we're modeling how it's done to help them remember how to do certain things. There are all sorts of ways to support them while they continue to do the activities that they enjoyed pre-diagnosis. But isn't that, we're already doing, we're so willing to do other things for them so that they don't have to do it, but if we put that energy into helping them to continue, then that's a win-win all the way around. As they say here, now they might not be as quick, or they might not think of things that they're going to do on their own like they used to. They might not immediately remember, but once initiated, they will enjoy the different activities. And as I said before, they can learn new activities. We're going to talk about living well with dementia. I have some bullet points here. Remember, it's a slowly progressing disease. And the diagnosis doesn't mean that everything's going to change all of a sudden. So in the early to mid stages, many people experience mild cognitive impairment, which can be managed while living a fairly normal life. That's early to mid stages. And here I want to stop just a moment and talk about how words matter. Choosing to use the word dementia is really unfortunate because demented means crazy, insane, mad. And people with dementia are none of those things. People with dementia have a brain disease. So it's just a bad choice of words, and I wish we'd never started using it. I would like for us to start referring to this condition, whether it's Alzheimer's, Lewy bodies, vascular, as cognitive impairment, which makes a lot of sense, right? The brain function has been weakened, cognitive impairment. Try to start developing that. I have a friend who said that once she started referring to her mother's dementia as mild cognitive impairment or moderate cognitive impairment, she could see that it changed the way her mother felt about herself. Let's just throw that word dementia out the window. I'm still trying to train myself not to use it. It might take some time, but it's worth the effort. And it fits. We could have those three different stages, mild, moderate, and severe. Okay, back to living well with dementia. The person living with dementia should be as involved as possible for as long as possible in making decisions about their care and treatment. If your doctor stopped talking directly to your loved one soon after diagnosis, even though they would be perfectly capable of answering their questions, then again, find a new doctor. It's real easy as a caregiver. I tend to be a little bit bossy, so I fell prey to some of this because I was so intent on being sure that my mother had the best possible care that sometimes I would kind of step in and make decisions that I should have involved her in, and I regret that. Don't live with that regret yourself. For as long as possible, let them help in making any decisions about their career. That's just common dignity. Living well with dementia, set up the environment for success. So you need to create a dementia-friendly environment. You always keep safety in mind. Safety is always paramount, but also ease of function as your priorities. So, and remember, we want to keep them active and doing things and feeling useful. So, if they're at a stage to where they could no longer really set the table, then put in the middle of the table, put a picture of where the place setting should be. If you bring in the groceries and they're just not sure where stuff goes, go around your kitchen, label things. Do things that are going to enable them to be as useful as possible, and that is really going to make a difference in how they see themselves and how you're going to be able to feel about your caregiving. And first and foremost is clear the clutter. Clutter is the enemy of people living with dementia. Clutter is the enemy of people living with depression. Let me say that again. Clutter is also the enemy of people living with depression. And we know that 40% of family caregivers often struggle with depression. If you fall in that 40%, first of all, go see a doctor and see if there's not some medications that will help you. Second of all, clear the clutter out of your house. You'll feel better. Use memory prompters. Sometimes people get this idea that people living with cognitive impairment, that if you give them helpers with their memory, then that leads to further decline. No. Use memory prompters. For a period of time, reminders and prompters can reduce frustration and embarrassment. Anything that can reduce frustration and embarrassment will help keep your loved one more willing to be engaged with others so they don't self-isolate. So you got, all these things, setting reminders on smartphones, watches, keeping whiteboard, daily reminders, to-do lists in plain sight. I need these things now. Certainly, there's nothing wrong with them is the point I'm trying to make. And they can make a big difference in your loved one's ability to feel secure and feel prepared to be around others and not be embarrassed by their memory loss. And again, we've said this before, I'm going to say it again. Focus on remaining strengths. You can encourage success by providing opportunities of fun and purpose. You saw that picture of the respite ministry. They have a lot of activities, and there's so many activities that you can find online. I recommend you Google Montessori activities for people living with dementia. But it's really important to fit the activity to the functioning level of your loved one, though. I know they used to try to get my mother to do things that she said, I'm not 2 years old. It made her mad. And we want to make sure that it's not so challenging to frustrate them, but it's not so simple that they're insulted by it. We want to provide verbal reminders or modeling. Sometimes if you sit by them and do the things along with them, they can kind of glance over and see what you're doing, and that will prompt them to do the right thing without them feeling like you're having to show them like they're a child. Also, it's very important to break larger tasks into smaller steps. And you can just make adjustments that will simplify the tasks and activities. Finally, I wanted to share this with you. This is the Caregiver Contract with Yourself. It's by Lisa Gibbons. Recognize that the job I do is not only rewarding and worthwhile, but also difficult and demanding. I care enough to find support and not attempt it alone. Now, I could do hours on trying to talk caregivers into reaching out for help. I'm just going to read these things with you today. But if you're one of those caregivers that says, I don't need any help, or I can do this by myself, or nobody can take as good a care of Mama as I can, or if I get help, then people will think I don't know what I'm doing. If those are the things, if there's anything standing between you and reaching out for the support of others, please find a way to eliminate that barrier. 2, being flexible and forgiving will allow me to stay on track with fewer negative emotions that can derail my best efforts. I care enough to let go and move forward. I also want to tell you that sometimes people have a hard time understanding that the actions that their loved one is exhibiting are caused by the dementia. Sometimes we have a hard time understanding the difference that dementia has made in their behaviors, and so we think, well, she was just trying to control me, or she could really do better, or whatever. No, please, 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 no, to blame it on the dementia. You don't want to have that resentment towards your loved one. Resent dementia. Unless I communicate my needs and feelings, I can't expect help and support. I care enough to reach out and share with others so that isolation and depression won't sabotage my journey. So many times I've heard people say, well, my brother knows I need help. I shouldn't have to ask him, or people should just come up and volunteer. Don't. People aren't mind readers. You know, if you need help, find a way to communicate to others that you need that help. And then just state simply, I need some time off. Would you please come sit with Mom for 2 hours next Sunday afternoon? And then shut up. Don't be making excuses. Don't say anything else. And then if they say no, move on to the next person to ask. This is a marathon. I need to refuel along the way with rest, reflection, and respite. I care enough to replenish and recharge by identifying the people, places, and things that give me physical and emotional strength. So true, so true. People go into the caregiving oftentimes thinking it's a sprint, and they just get all exhausted, and then they're sleep deprived, and if you don't learn how to pace yourself, you're going to be in real trouble. I'm entitled to have my own life, and I will take my oxygen first. I care enough to get rid of guilt and banish blame so that I can claim my own life in order to give more. I hope that this webinar has given you a lot to think about. I hope it's given you some tips to change the way you interact with your loved one and your expectations of how society will treat you and your loved one. Please continue to view our webinars in this series. I think they'll all be very helpful to you. And I appreciate your time today. I thank you for spending it with me.
Thank you so much, Gail. It was such a pleasure to have you on today. And thank you for sharing how we might find the silver lining after a diagnosis. Just as a reminder to viewers that we do have the post-test pasted onto this last slide. Please take it at your earliest convenience. A certificate can be provided by entering your email address at the end of the post-test. And please also remember to view the other webinars in the Dementia Capable webinar series provided by the Rosalind Carter Institute for Caregiving in partnership with the Georgia Division on Aging Services. Thank you again, and we hope that you'll join us again.